Thank you, Brittany Howard. She was almost not being able to be here today because there's a big fire alarm going off. So we're very lucky that she was able to help us out today. Um, so I'm going to introduce myself. As she said, I'm Nancy, and I'm a partner here at Tully Rinckey. And I focus a lot of my practice on matrimonial and family law. And with that, uh, I've seen a lot of what goes on after people get divorced. And the presentation today is mostly to discuss what happens when your judgment is entered and you walk out and you have that piece of paper that says you're divorced. So this is really to assist people with what to do after they get divorced and how to manage being divorced and being co-parents. And even if you did not go through a divorce, or if you're just separated, or even if you are just co-parents, I believe that this can be a very helpful webinar for you, because it's just really information to be, going forward as co-parents. So we were able to get a really great code for everybody today, which I think Brittany's going to put up again at the end of the webinar. But one of the things that makes co-parenting that much easier is the ability to communicate with your co-parent. And the ability to co-parent with communication, some people like the ability to use apps. And our family wizard was able to make it possible today to give everybody who participates today a 10% discount. And I'm going to talk about what these apps are and why they're helpful and what they do a little bit later on. And we can come back to the wonderful promo that was given a little bit later on. And we'll show it again, and it'll be available to everybody going forward. So what does the judgment of divorce mean, and what happens? So the judgment of divorce is what you get when your divorce is entered and the assets have been split up and you are absolutely divorced. And people think, well, that's the end of it. Now I'm divorced, I'm done. Unfortunately, that's really just the beginning of everything at that point, especially if you have children and they are not, in college, or they're not older. If you have children that are younger, you have a full life ahead of you of co-parenting. And the question is, well, what do you do now? What do I do with this agreement? What do I, how do I enforce it? How do I make sure that everything in my agreement gets followed? And what do I do if my co-parent doesn't follow the agreement? And that is really what this webinar is about, is what happens if somebody doesn't follow the agreement. We always hope that parents do follow the agreement. That's always, the hope, that we put together this agreement for people and that they follow it. Unfortunately, not everybody does. And lawyers are always here. Mediators are always available if you need to enforce that agreement. But I think the most important thing is to really understand what that agreement is, and to, before you are finished with your lawyer, to really understand what the agreement is and what it means. So we're going to go through what that agreement is and how that, what it all means. So now that your marriage is all over, I'd love to tell you what the best dating apps are, but that's probably for another webinar. Your orders are in effect, and you and your partner, your ex-spouse, are bound to follow the terms of the judgment. And what that means is if you fail to comply with any of the terms of the judgment, you can be brought back to court. And failing to comply means contempt of court. And contempt of court can mean a few things. It can be, in the worst way, it can be a judge, holding you in jail. It can be fines, or it could mean that you're responsible for the other party's legal fees. Some divorce agreements actually state in the agreement that if you are responsible and you have to be brought back to court and the other party wins, you are then responsible automatically for the other party's legal fees. And sometimes those legal fees can be extremely excessive, and that is not something you want to be responsible for. So that's something to think about when you decide, maybe I'm not going to pay child support, or maybe I'm not going to return my child on time, and somebody has to enforce that agreement. In the back of your head, it might be a good idea to think about, I might be responsible for somebody else's legal fees. So that's a very, very important thing to think about. That not be the reason not to not comply, but that is a very important thing to think about. So when you are getting your agreement in order, there are certain steps when you're reading the agreement, what you should and should not think about. Now you have your agreement. There are a few things that you need to think about. Obviously, if you want to change your name, you can change your name, passport, driver's license, credit card, get all that in your own name. Make sure that you read your documents and see what it is that you need to do. Look at your agreement very carefully. See if you need to refinance your house, transfer any funds, and get it done in the time that your agreement says that you have to get it done, so nobody holds you in contempt. It's very important. You want to make sure you transfer cell phones probably before the agreement and judgment is entered. Transfer everything into your own name. People tend to forget these things. Transfer everything into your own name. And when that judgment is entered, you may want to make sure you change the beneficiaries of your will, and do whatever you need to do to update everything into your own name. Now that everything is split, you want to make sure that your documents reflect that. So when it comes to custody, parents have the ultimate right to custody of their own children. So you can't really change the custody when you're updating your will, because the other parent would have the right to custody of the child. But the most important thing would be that if the other parent is already deceased, that you make arrangements for where you would want your children to go. So that's why I have included that. It's very important that you have your wishes known in your own will. So before that, we're going to turn to what custody and visitation is all about, and what types of custody and visitation you can possibly have in your agreement. I'm talking about custody and visitation And it's extremely important that you understand what you agreed to. Make sure your attorney has explained to you exactly what your agreement means. So you can have joint custody. There are two types of custody that are going to be in your agreement. There's legal custody and there's physical custody. Legal custody explains how decisions are made, and that can be very, very different. It can be that you both make decisions together. It can be that one person gets the final say. It could be that the one person, gets to inform the other person, and then they have to go back to court. It could be that you need to contact a mediator before you make a decision. It could be that you have to involve a professional before you make a decision. It could be that there are spheres of decision making, which means one person may be able to make decisions about education, where the other person makes decisions about medical. Another person could make decisions about religion. So it is very important that you understand what the legal custody means. Those are the areas of legal custody. Physical custody is where the children live. And wherever the children live, at least 51% of the time is residential custody. And sometimes that can be based upon where the children need to go to school. The other parent will have parenting time. A lot of times we refer to it as visitation, but there's really a move now to equal and shared custody when we talk about where children live. And a question that I get a lot of the time is, if children live equally at each parent's house, does somebody have to pay child support? And that's always a big hot button issue. If you come to an agreement, you can agree to have no child support as long as there's an explanation in your agreement as to why there's no child support. But the New York law says that one person has to pay child support, because child support's not for the parent, it is for the children. And so there always has to be somebody paying child support. So it's very important that you understand your custody and visitation, mostly so that you don't violate what the custody and visitation order state. You don't want to be late. You don't want to miss your custody and visitation time, and you don't want to violate it. You don't want to keep the children longer than you're supposed to. And the most important thing is that you don't want to prevent the other parent from seeing the children, because that can be extremely harmful in the long run. The custodial parent's main job is to make sure that the other parent sees the children. So a lot of the violations that we see are due to the fact that one parent is preventing another parent from seeing the children. So the most important thing is that you understand what your agreement is and you stick to it. So in the next slide, the schedule that parents have is a very important issue. One of the first questions that I get is, if the other co-parent doesn't stick to the schedule, can I call the police? And the police really cannot enforce your agreement. They'll come to the house and they will say, go to family court or call your attorney, because they can't, there's really not much they can do about enforcing your agreement. They really don't want to enforce your agreement and they don't want to be involved. They will come to the defense if there's an order of protection in place, but they will tell parents to try to cooperate. So if you notify the other parent that you want to make a change, we recommend that you do it in advance and you do it in writing so that there's a record. That is the most important thing when it comes to notifying the other parent. My recommendation would always be you do it in writing and you do it in advance, because some people get very stuck to the schedule and they don't want to make changes to the schedule. So if you want to change, let's say, one weekend and switch it up for another, the other parent may not be flexible. Some parents are not flexible and they do not want to change up the schedule. So you always have to remember, if you want the other parent to be flexible, you should be flexible. And if the other parent doesn't agree to make changes, you can't force somebody to make changes. It is not illegal for a parent to refuse to make changes to the schedule. If they want to stick to the schedule, that is their right to stick to a schedule. So in most agreements, we do try to account for what's considered those strange days. There are days when children are sick, stay home from school sick. There are days that are holidays in the middle of the week. There are vacation days. For example, yesterday was a day off in the middle of the week. So if you are, you have an overnight with your child and the next day you have to go to work, but your child does not, oftentimes you wonder, well, the next day is the day off. Who has the child the next day? I have to go to work and I can't stay home, and what happens and who's responsible and who gets to have the child. So these are the problems that arise in the middle of a parenting schedule. So you want to make sure while you are creating the schedule that these are the days that you account for, and that you're not left holding, an issue and, fighting over who gets to have the child or who needs to, make arrangements for where the children will go on these, I refer to them as the weird off days in the middle of the week. Because if you both have to go to work, somebody has to be responsible or be home with the children, or make sure that somebody is home with the children in the middle of the week. So not everybody gets off the same days as the children. So you want to make sure that the children's schedule is taken care of. So you also want to make sure that both parents are entitled to go to, if it's possible, all the after-school activities, all of the parent-teacher conferences. These are the little minutia that come up when you're thinking about your parenting schedule and about your parenting plan. You both may not want to go to a parent-teacher conference together. So you may want to make 2 parenting conferences. So these are the things that you want to make sure that you account for in your parenting plan. For certain holidays, we try to split them up so that both parents are entitled to time, maybe on Christmas, so that one parent has Christmas Eve and one parent is entitled to Christmas Day. And it's important that you remember when you are speaking to the other parent that it's always possible that somebody's going to use whatever you write to them in a future court appearance. I always say, be very careful about what you write because you don't know how somebody's going to use it in the future. And I think that it's always good to remember not to curse when you speak to another parent, that you have to remember whatever you say, they are going to try to use against you. And I know that sounds like a terrible thing, but that's what it comes down to. If somebody wants to modify or change an order, they're going to try to find anything and everything terrible that you've ever said and done, and they will use it. So if you've said, in a text to them, I'm going to do something terrible, they're going to pull out that terrible little section and use it against you. So I recommend never emailing in anger. If they have said something nasty to you, put down the phone and do not answer. Just put away the phone and don't send a text in anger. This can be the worst thing you can ever do. Just don't answer it back. If you can wait and just, give it a few minutes, it will save you a lot of heartache in the long run. I have always said, just remember that a judge is going to be looking at everything that you write, and keep that in mind when you answer text messages. So that's why we've included a code today. So there are parenting apps that people have chosen to use, and it's not just people who can't get along. What the parenting apps do, and I think sometimes it's good for people who can get along and can't get along. So there's some things, these apps have come a really, really long way. And some of the things that are terrific about them, and you don't need a court order to agree to them. Parents can agree to them on their own. But what's the one that we have a code for today specifically is our Family Wizard. What's amazing about that is they have something called a tone meter, which is a brand new feature that they won't let you answer something in an obnoxious and nasty way, which is something I think that people have been looking for years. It's pretty amazing. The nice thing that I think the other thing about that people have been looking for is GPS tracking to make sure that parents drop off at a certain time. If one parent says, I'm going to drop off at karate at a certain time, the other parent has absolutely no idea if they have. And the nice thing is that you can track to make sure that the parent says that they are where they are at a certain time. It's incredibly helpful so that you're not left wondering, hey, did my kid get to, band practice on time? You can just look and see, yep, they got there on time. And it's a really nice thing to know, people got to places on time. The other useful thing is that some people try to file enforcement actions or violations for being late. And with these parenting apps, you can say, I wasn't late. Maybe I was 3 minutes late, 4 minutes late. But you can say, I showed up at the diner where I was supposed to at 10:03. I wasn't really late. There was a little bit of traffic, but I've been consistently on time, and a judge can see that you weren't late. So there is something nice about being able to prove that you weren't as late as somebody is trying to make it out to be. Before, you would have to go only on somebody else's word or on your own word. This way, it is a little bit of tracking on your own life, but there is something nice about being able to prove that you were where you were when you said you were. The other thing is that there is a shared calendar, and I know that people do a lot of shared calendar with Google and everything, which is great. The really nice thing about these parenting apps is that if somebody makes a change to a shared calendar, it shows specifically when the change was made, who made the change, and how it was made. So if somebody changes a weekend, there's a record of it. It can't just be that somebody changed a weekend and, oh, that was always the way it was. There's no ability to gaslight anybody and say that's always the way it was. There's a record of who made the change, when it was changed, and it's very easy to see all of the information. Another pretty amazing feature is tracking of expenses. And I'm going to get into the expenses a little bit, but when you enter your order and your judgment, there are, with child support, first of all, there's the basic payments that need to be paid, but there are also out-of-pocket expenses that are shared. And what's really great about the way these apps work is you can say, I paid this doctor bill, it was $100, I paid $50, I paid $100, you're responsible for $50. Here's, you're responsible. So I'm waiting for my portion to be paid. And it's either been paid or it hasn't been paid. And it keeps track of what payments are owed and what payments are still needing to be paid. And that is an unbelievable way to keep track of what is still owed, because that can really get out of hand if you don't keep a good record of it. And the other thing is that it keeps track of phone calls, which is a very interesting thing, because some people, maybe you live out of state, and maybe you are entitled to have phone calls with your child by FaceTime, and the other parent is not allowing you to get your phone calls. There's this incredible feature that allows you to document that you make the phone call and either the other parent answers or doesn't answer. And that can be an amazing feature when you need to enforce your action, or if you have to violate the other person. Because one of the things, as I was saying, the custodial parent's job is to make sure that the non-custodial parent has time with the child. Now, if you live out of state and you are entitled to certain phone calls, and you're supposed to have 2 phone calls a week at 7 o'clock, and the other parent is just never home, you're not getting your phone calls, or you're not getting your time. And if the other parent is not even bothering to be home or to change the time, you're not getting any time with your child. So it's very important that let's say you called through the parenting app and shows that you call on Tuesday at 7 o'clock, and it rings and it rings and nobody answers. And this happens every week during the time that you are supposed to call. And the other parent says, no, I was home. No phone call was made. With these, with at least with our Family Wizard, it actually has a video and it shows you calling and no answer. So that is a very significant issue when somebody is trying to document that they're not getting their parenting time, especially through phone calls. And it may sound a little minor to somebody who gets visitation time with their child every week, but to somebody who's out of state and their only contact is through FaceTime, it is such a significant issue, and it really can make or break their week if they don't get their parenting time with their child. So there are a lot of benefits to using a parenting app if you need one. And, you know, there are incredible options available to people. And there are more than just a few parenting apps, which we have a few of them listed in the next slide. And I think it's important for people to go through and look and see what the parenting apps, you know, don't necessarily think one is better than the other. You know, there are several out there that are available. As I said, our Family Wizard includes that tone monitor and the expense tracker and the GPS. There's Talking Parents, which has secure messaging. There's App Close, which is free, and I know a lot of people love to use that because it is free and it has several features that are available. There's Cozy, which I know people use all the time as a family organizer, but there's not a legal side to it, so I'm not sure how that would play into it. And then there's Two Houses, which has a calendar and finance. What's nice about some of them is that they offer downloadable email so that you can enter them into court, which makes it very easy for attorneys if they want to use the emails back and forth to get them into evidence, which can be a very nice thing to help your attorney. The other thing is that they also have the ability for attorneys to go in and look and see what the conversations are, as well as have access to the finances, which can be very, very helpful as far as helping attorneys. So the next thing that I was going to talk about is paying your child support. So if you are the payor, it's extremely important, even if you're the payee, that you understand what your child support order says in your judgment or even in your agreement. It is probably the most important so that you don't violate that order. Violating a child support order can one day wind you up in jail, and you don't want that. So it's first, you know, you want to make sure that you pay on time. You pay never with cash. You want to make sure that you pay so that you can prove one day that you did pay. There's so many ways of paying electronically these days. That would be my recommendation. If you don't pay through support collection or through your paycheck, make sure you're paying electronically so you can keep track of the payments. And if somebody ever says, no, you didn't pay, you can pull out your phone or your checkbook, whatever it is, and say, here's how I paid. And I think that's usually the best way to prove that you did pay, because if somebody takes you back to court to say that you didn't pay, the easiest thing to show, and it's your responsibility to show that you made the payments. And I was just saying, there's Zelle, there's Venmo, and you can always pay through the support collection unit. And if that discrepancy does arrive, having those electronic records to put into the court is the easiest way to show that you did make the payments. And it is the payee's burden to prove that they did make the payments. That is the only way to show that you are not in violation of the order. And that failure to pay is what gets most people brought back to court. The failure to pay is considered a willful violation, and that is usually what the enforcement and violations are all about. So that is a lot of what the enforcement after court, after the judgment is entered, people usually come to us and say, you know, my co-parent is not paying support. What can we do? Or, you know, that is a big problem that we have. So one way to keep track of expenses, the next slide, if you're not using one of the apps, you can make a chart of out-of-pocket expenses that if you need to show proof that you paid, or that you didn't, or that you need to be paid, you can always make a chart if you decide not to, you know, use one of the apps. There are certain expenses that are paid by statute, and there are certain expenses that people agree to as part of their agreement. So if in your agreement you agree to extracurricular activities, that's what you are responsible for. But there are certain expenses that are statutory. The statutory expenses are the out-of-pocket medical and childcare. But some people, as part of their agreement, will agree to extracurricular activities. Some children are very, you know, they have certain things that they want to do. And if you fail to pay those out-of-pocket expenses, somebody can enforce their order and take you back to court to have those expenses paid. And so it's very important to keep track of what expenses are paid and which are not paid. And so it's very easy to just make a chart and keep track. So what the problem that comes up is what happens now that you understand that you have this order. What the order says is what happens when somebody fails to comply with the terms of the order, because now you know exactly what the order says, and we know that you're complying with everything in the order. But when somebody doesn't comply with the order, or violates the order, when somebody doesn't comply, that's when you have the problem. And that's usually when people come to us and say, well, what do we do now? So you've kept track of all of your expenses. You have now kept track of all of the visitation, and you have complied with the order. And if the other party is not complying, you would then decide if you need to seek a violation or a modification, and you would go back to family court. So your order was probably entered in the Supreme Court, and when you seek to enforce the orders, you go to family court. So if the other party is not allowing you to have your phone calls, or they are not allowing you to have your visitation, or they are doing something that is making things difficult, or maybe you only were entitled to supervised visitation, or maybe you were out of state and now you've moved in state and you want to modify the order to get more visitation. These are the reasons you would go back to family court to change the custody or the visitation order. That's what the modification is for. If you are not getting something that you are entitled to, that would be a reason to file a violation. So they're pretty complex when it comes to custody. There usually needs to be a change of circumstances when you file for a custody modification. And that can be pretty complicated. For child support, when you file a violation, that would be because somebody is not paying something that they are supposed to pay. When you file a modification for child support, that would be based upon the fact that it has been 3 years or somebody's income has changed by 15%. And that is by statute. And usually it is agreed to in the original agreement. Sometimes, unfortunately, people do lose their job and they do go back to court and try to seek a downward modification during the time that they have lost their job. And that can be somewhat complicated as well. It's not always a guarantee that somebody will get a downward modification, because you do have to show that you are looking for a job as well. So nothing is guaranteed, and it can be pretty complicated. And it is something that people want to do all the time, and it's a little bit complicated to get into, but that is something that can be done. But it is not enough to just have lost a job. However, if you haven't received a support payment in 3 months, you can go back to court to enforce the order and for a violation of support. And that would be something that you would file in family court as well. So you would go back to court and say that the other party hasn't paid, and they would have to show why they didn't pay, or they would have to show that they paid and somehow you are wrong. So there are many reasons for returning to court, and all of these things are usually filed in family court. And there can be so many reasons for filing a modification or a violation in family court, for support, or for custody. And the difference between an enforcement action versus a child support action, an enforcement versus a modification, sometimes the actual petition will say it's an enforcement and a modification, which is fine. They usually do them together. But if you want to enforce something, it usually, you want to show that somebody has failed to comply, that somebody has done something wrong, that they didn't pay their support, or they didn't do something, and or they didn't give you your phone calls, or they didn't let you have your visitation. A modification is when you want to change something, that it requires to show that something is different than it was at the time when it was first entered. So that's just a difference between when you enforce versus you modify. So I think we should show the code again so that people, if they want to use the code for our great code that they generously gave us for our family wizard, which they were kind enough to do. Again, you know, I just, they were kind enough to give it to us. We told them what we were doing today. And if we have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Now it seems like somebody's interested in specifically for co-parenting and parenting plans for high school age children, possible problems and solutions.
So is there any, is it specific or just in high school in general?
I think it's just high school in general.
So I find that with high school kids, they tend to want to do their own thing. That if it's just high school kids, I don't tend to set up a specific parenting schedule, because when it comes to high school kids, they tend to have their own agenda anyway, and they will sort of go back and forth as they see fit. And you can set up a schedule for them, but they do usually, do their own thing anyway. You can set up a general schedule, maybe weekends with one parent so that somebody's taking them somewhere or making sure they're getting to certain activities, but they often, have their own life. They have their own parties to go to. And it does get difficult, especially when it comes to paying for college. Those things, that's a difficult thing to make sure that college is paid for in your agreement. And you can set it up so that parents are only responsible up to a New York State school, or you can agree to pay for, whatever type of college plan that you want. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that's usually how we, I know that it's a difficult time with graduation coming up, and that there have been a lot of issues with attending graduations, and that's always a hot button, and that we always recommend that parents do what's in the best interests of their children, and that you remember you're not there to be there for you, you're there to be there for your children. So if they don't want a significant other coming, you respect their wishes and you do what is the best thing for your children.
Any tips on dealing with co-parents who are possibly narcissistic or who have been difficult for the sake of being difficult?
Yes, I definitely recommend using the apps, because when parents are difficult, they will twist your words and make things even more difficult. So talking to them in person becomes almost impossible, and they will use your words against you, and they will say that you did something when you did not. And this is a perfect example for why an app like Our Family Wizard is fantastic, because you'll say you showed up at a specific time and they'll say, no, you didn't. And now you have perfect proof. I have one client who is supposed to have phone calls, and the other parent is claiming that she never calls, and started using this to show that they are never home when she calls. And it has really made a huge difference, because, he testified in court, she never calls. Here's my phone. Erased everything. So presenting this in court has been extremely, extremely helpful. So, narcissists tend to change the facts of things. So if you have something that is concrete, it makes it very difficult for them to change the facts, and also makes it very difficult for them to change the calendar.
What kind of agreements or arrangements, I'm sorry, need to be made and put into an agreement of a one-time settlement that is done in order to avoid any future demand for child support or spousal support?
A one-time demand for,
One-time settlement is done in order to avoid any future demand for child support or spousal support.
so, I mean, you could write in the agreement that there will never be any modification, but I think that if a judge saw that in the future, they would deem it to be against public policy, and it would not hold up because it would be really unfair. I don't think that you could ever put into an agreement that it could never be modified. You could maybe say that it couldn't be modified or changed for a certain amount of time, or you could say that it couldn't be modified for a certain reason. You can also decide to pay it all up front. I mean, that's been done. You know, you could figure out what child support is for the, you know, and decide to pay it all up front. That's been done as well if you wanted to be done and, you know, make it easy. That's definitely been done. Some people trade the amount of a house for child support. I mean, there are a lot of creative ways of getting around things. So if you don't ever want to pay child support, you figure out what it's worth and you make a trade. So that's something that you can think about as well.
One question that just came in says, how long in the past payments or bills need to be saved?
Forever. I mean, until they're paid. I would save them until they're paid. And I would make sure that you have the original, and you know, I wouldn't, if you have a bill for the pharmacy, I would make sure that it shows the child's name and the original receipt, because if you go to the pharmacy and it just says, you know, the payment, you know, I would make the argument, well, I don't know who you paid that for, right? So I don't know if you made it for you. I don't know if you paid it for me. So I would save the actual paper that says, you know, you paid $20 for Billy's, you know, I don't know, whatever you know, whatever prescription they got. So if there's ever an issue, you can show that you paid for their prescription and not for yours. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.